Our very first edition of the Lives of the Saints. And what this is just a time of conversation between me, Father Chris, the rector at St. David's, with some of the saints in our congregation. And today is episode 1 with none other than Leonard and Joanne Sackett. We will get to hear from them shortly. I wanted to mention, though, when I was first called rector here at St. David's a dozen years ago, Leonard was the senior warden. And so throughout my time at St. David's, they have been passionate advocates for the poor and the vulnerable and involved in all kinds of ministries. And so we are going to hear from them as we begin our very first edition of the Lives of the Saints. And so Joanne and Leonard, welcome.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And where are you coming to us from?
This is the sunroom in our house, the back of the house. This is the playroom where the computer's at, and Joanne's dollhouse.
Oh, okay. Joanne, you're still playing with dolls then? And
Oh yeah. Although can't look at it too closely, it's pretty dusty in there. I haven't worked on it for quite a while.
Okay. And I remember. Go ahead.
I had to put some plexiglass up because the cat likes to get up there and chew on it.
Play dollhouse.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a dollhouse, not a cat house.
Yeah, right.
We'll get into your family a little bit more as we move along here. But first, I want to ask you to just kind of introduce yourself and tell us how long you've been parishioners at St. David's.
Well, we came to St. David's in 1973. We just moved back from Iowa. We've been in Iowa when we first got married, and we were out there for about 5 years, 6 years in Iowa. And then we got the opportunity. I got a job with General Motors. So we moved back to this area, and it just so happens my sister also lived in Berkeley. So we were using her house as our base, and we were house hunting. So that ended up in Berkeley, and we looked at St. John's, Royal Oak. We looked at St. David's, and I think we went to St. David's once, and Joanne got hooked.
Margaret Cheney literally took me by the hand after the service was over with and walked us down to the fellowship hall and introduced us to, Dee Bryant and Barb Thomas, who no longer at St. David's, and several other people, and said, you just have to come back next week. So we did.
They're on.
And then we never tried looking anyplace else.
And what?
47
I'm sorry.
years.
Has it been 47 years?
Yes.
My goodness. And then let's see. What? Leonard, to go back a little bit farther. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Plymouth Township. So I went to St. John's Church in Plymouth all my life, and went to their old building, which is now torn down, and they're in St. John's, the main one. I was there as an acolyte. Mother was a Sunday school teacher and involved in the parish.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and your career has been in engineering. And have you always worked for car companies?
No. I started out in aerospace. I was at Collins Radio in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Worked on the space program and some military projects. Then there was a big layoff then back in the 68, 69, 70. The Vietnam War was going on, so the federal budget was in trouble. So the space program was winding down, and military expenditures were winding down. And at the time, Collins was very heavy into avionics, but now it's 747s come along, and you only need one set of avionics, and you can fly 3 times as many people. So the avionics sales also kind of decreased.
Yeah.
And so that folded up, and I moved farther west Iowa to a small company and worked there for about a year and a half. Didn't really like it.
Mm-hmm.
Got an and Michigan wasn't hiring. You couldn't get a job with GM or Ford back at that time. But then about a year and a half later, after I was out there, there was job openings. I got one at Cadillac. It also turned out my resume was still there from a year and a half ago. So they called me up, and I went for an interview and started at General Motors.
Okay. Now, General Motors has more than one office building. Where did you start?
Cadillac at Clark Street. That's where the Cadillac Engineering Center was. At that time, we were all separate divisions, and the Buick Flint, and Cadillac in Detroit, and Chevrolet in Warren, and Pontiac and Lansing, and all competitors. All competitors. Each of us could do it better.
My goodness. And do you remember some of the first projects you worked on when you started working at General Motors?
Oh yeah, I was in the labs to start out with. When I was at Collins, as it was called environmental group, we would do analysis of. We were working on a sonobuoy at one time at Collins, where it was something could be launched from an aircraft or a submarine, and detect where Russian submarines and other traffic was at. Worked on that indirectly. Anyway, so I was in the labs at Cadillac, fatigue and stress lab, and we were always testing. We really just worked on the parts that weren't working, getting them to work. So I was in the labs for probably about 10, 12 years. And then I was switched over to GM, got into this project center where every division would supply personnel, and we'd work on a new car program. So whatever divisions were going to be in this new car program, they'd supply personnel for it. So I went out to Warren for half a dozen years working on future car programs.
Okay.
In corrosion control area. I was corrosion control coordinator.
Which I think that in the 70s, they sure needed that.
Yeah, I remember when I was growing up as a kid. My dad's cars, within 2 or 3 years, the rocker panels were rusting out. You got to be older to remember that stuff. In 2 or 3 years, the fenders were rusting out. We kind of got caught flat-footed. After World War II, we had the expressway system went in, and everybody started moving to the suburbs. Mm-hmm. Well, but the work was in Detroit or in the cities, and we lived in the suburbs. And in the wintertime, you couldn't get down to work unless you put copious amounts of salt on the roads. So the roads were clear. And the cars weren't designed for that. They were designed for the environment we had prior to World War II. So then also the Japanese were making cars that were designed for us, so we had to play catch up. That was a big program during the 70s, was catching up and surpassing the Japanese.
Now you have, as long as I've known you, Len, you've had quite a heart for the poor and for the vulnerable. And I'm wondering how your spiritual life kind of affected this sense of giving back that you have.
Yeah, it did. It really did. I really enjoyed, as I said, when I was working General on this corrosion control, because that was everybody's car. I hated seeing that people buy a car, back then, $20,000, $30,000, and then within just a few years, it was junk, at least in the Northeast. So it was, I saw it as a environmental, religious kind of thing to be working on that thing. So I was a little bit carried away with it.
Well, no, but I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, when you say how do you live your spirituality and your profession's a priest, it's kind of an easy answer. But when you're in charge of important aspects of everyday items like cars, certainly the profit motive has always plays a role. When a company's got to survive, it's got to keep jobs, it's got to make money, it's got to satisfy shareholders. But it's also, as you say, got a commitment. It has some environmental factors as well that weigh in.
Yeah. Well, there's that, and felt like I was doing some worthwhile work in that area when I was in that area. And then, Joanne, she's the one that's really, both of us really, she's concerned about other people. Now,
wife. Joanne, while Leonard was working, you were certainly not sitting at home doing nothing either. Tell us about your path to faith. Did you grow up? In what faith? Describe to us your spiritual life.
Well, my family didn't really go to church, but my dad would always take me and my siblings to church and drop us off. And I always wanted to go. It was a Cherry Hill Presbyterian Church in Dearborn. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up just going to Sunday school there and getting introduced to other kids that I knew from school and then also from church. So then when Leonard and I got married, we got married in that church, but I knew before we got married that I would become was going to becoming an Episcopalian because I liked the ritual with the church, and I liked the involvement that his family had inside.
Yeah.
I always had that feeling, that need of being more involved religiously with church rather than just Sunday school and go home.
Yeah. Yeah. And tell me, tell us how you and Leonard met.
Well, we met at Henry Ford Community College. We were in an economics class. He sat in front of the class, and I sat in back, my girlfriend. And little did I know that during that class that this was the guy I was going to marry. And that was our first year of college, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But then we were both going with dating other people, and finally, when I was finished college, graduated, and I was teaching, and I decided to take some schoolwork, correct over to school, over to the library at U of M to see if there was anybody there, because it was just well, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was just which they had just come back from their work assignment. Mm-hmm. And Leonard was in there, and I went and sat there and didn't get any corrections done on these papers that I had brought in. He didn't get much homework done either, because we just talked. And from there, we went out and started dating. And
Do you remember your first date? Do you remember where you went?
yeah, we went to a movie at the university. We were at the U of M Dearborn campus, and there was a movie playing there, a girl with green eyes.
I think it was free.
It was free.
It was free, yeah.
So Leonard took you to, the good news is he took you to a movie. The worrying news is that it was free.
Yeah.
Well, you're in college and these things happen.
Yeah.
And so you grew up Presbyterian, and you guys started dating, got to know one another, thought the Episcopal Church might be a place where God was calling you.
Yes.
And what, just to recap, and you like the involvement of the family that was meaningful for you. And you have, together, you guys have, have enlarged the family.
Yeah, a little, yeah.
Yeah.
We have two kids, our son.
Say it again.
Our son is 27.
Yep.
Oh, I mean, 27.
40.
47.
Time flies.
49. He's 49.
Yeah.
And Heather is 45.
45. Okay. And then you've got some grandkids.
Yeah, we have 5 granddaughters.
Mm-hmm.
2 of them in Ann Arbor with our son. Our son works for Toyota. And our daughter lives in Waterford with her 3 girls.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband.
Yeah, and tell us about your involvement at St. David's in terms of your outreach and the commitment that you've had through the years. Well, I guess should we first start with Sunday school? Is that the first thing you got involved in?
Yeah, well, it was St. Martha's Guild that I was really involved in.
And a guild, for those who have not heard of them, guilds were quite fashionable in years past, and that's usually because a lot of women did not work outside the home, and it was a way to express charitable and community, feelings people had to get together and to be with one another.
Yeah, we would do all the dinners at church.
Okay, so you'd make dinners.
Yeah, St. Martha's Guild would be in the kitchen, and we'd have speakers occasionally, and then we would also do service projects all the time. We met once a month. We bring our little kids with us, and we hired a babysitter to be in the nursery.
Mm-hmm.
And so that
Yeah.
play. We all had our kids at home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then I got into Sunday school.
And then you got into teaching Sunday school.
I did that
Okay.
for I don't know how many years.
Uh-huh.
And then got into South Oakland Shelter, helped with that. Then I over the being coordinator.
Now the South Oakland Shelter is. Were you at St. David's when we first became involved with the shelter?
Yeah, we were. I wasn't really involved. Joanne was more involved in church more back then. I was busy working.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was with General Motors for 10, 15 years I started becoming more involved. We had a boys' youth group too.
Yeah.
With under Jim Kenny. Jim Kenny's the guy that's always done it. And when our boy was young, and Rick Delmar, good friends of mine, his boy was young. Boys, we had the youth group with Jim. It was when it first started up.
Yep.
And so we participated in that. And then South Oakland Shelter came along.
Yeah.
And that started up about 25 years ago.
30.
Maybe.
Oh, at least, yeah, yeah. And that, of course, is a movable shelter in areas such as ours, where you have shelters in Detroit, you have shelters in Pontiac. We'll work halfway between them. Yet you still have, and in this day and age, a growing number of people who need a place to stay. Congregations open their doors and they rotate. So it's a rotating shelter scheme that still starts. But when you were involved, there were just a handful of churches, weren't there?
I'm not sure of the number, but
yeah, at first there was just a handful of, but
Yeah.
we were not really involved in it when it first got started.
Yeah.
The kids were still pretty young,
Yep.
and it was hard to
Right.
keep them from.
it was about it was going on maybe for 5 years when we personally started getting involved with it. It was pretty easy. I'd sleep overnight. Rick and I would, my good buddy, the two of us would take a night shift together and spend the night yakking, you know.
Right.
kind of together.
Well, in addition to attending church, which you guys have done and continue to do regularly, and all of the activities, many of which have been involved in helping the poor, helping the hungry, what other practices or activities bring you closer to God?
We love getting outdoors. Outdoors is it, and to me, outdoors is kind of cathedral. Go out there, I'm just always amazed that this creation that I feel God made, that we're live in. We don't own it, but we live in it. And the more you see of like the Hubble telescope, the stars beyond, it's just amazing, this great creation that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, getting out camping makes me feel close to God. When we love to go up and camp on Lake Superior and sit out there and watch the waves. It's so awesome. And one time when our kids were young, we were up there camping, and I went across the road to get away from everybody for a little bit, look at the birds, and I stood there for about 45 minutes watching one little bird and trying to figure out what it was. Just so quiet and so God inspiring.
Yeah.
So I always feel close to God.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's right, because you all have a vehicle that you've kitted out to do some pretty serious camping.
Well, at that time we didn't have that. We had tents.
Yeah.
And our marriage stayed together too. The first time I took Joanne camping, as a kid, I had a pup tent. Sears bought a canvas pup tent, Sears. I used it as a kid. That was fine. I didn't, So we're going to go out to Colorado camping. And so we take my canvas pup tent.
Holy pup tent.
Well, just a couple little holes. Anyway. And we bought some new sleeping bags. We went out there. What we didn't understand was it was middle of June. And it's not too bad back here in middle of June, but up in the mountains, it's still winter. So we got out there and froze our derrieres off. It snowed on us and rained on us.
And we were going to really rough it. We were going to cook over the campfire without a stove.
My vision didn't match reality.
Okay. Was this an ulterior motive to kind of cuddle a little bit more, Leonard?
Oh, we cuddled all right.
Oh my goodness.
No funny business.
Cold ground. So we went into town after a couple of days. We walked in the liquor store to get something antifreeze. And as soon as we walked through the door, the guy said, "Boy, you guys are camping, aren't you?" our wood smell. I mean, we were, anyway, and we stayed married though.
Right, right, right. Yeah.
We stayed married.
The conscious or unconscious tests that keep us together. Um,
Yeah.
well, let me ask you this. There's an author named Anne Lamott, and she says we only need 3 prayers, and they are help, thanks, and wow. Now, which one of these describes the type of prayers you mostly rely on? Help, thanks, wow.
I do a lot of thank yous.
Yeah.
A lot of thank yous.
Yeah.
That's mine too. I think very happy, very lucky for everything we have, and we just like to thank God for it. Thanks for our kids and grandkids.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you contemplate this idea of thankfulness, of gratitude, how important is that in your daily lives?
A lot.
Well, because I'm so thankful about what we have, what we can do, I like to try to do for others.
Yeah.
Because I feel so blessed.
Yeah.
It feels like it's a responsibility to
Yeah.
share. You know, it's been very good to us, and it's our responsibility then to share with those that maybe don't have it.
And the skills that I can sew, so I feel like I'm so thankful that I can do that because I get a lot of joy out of sewing for my kids, my grandkids, sew for them. My daughter, I made clothes for when she was little. She saved them, and her daughters wore some of the dresses that I made. But now I'm using that skill to make all my masks, and so I can give them out to other people that care about them.
Yeah.
Thank you for what I have.
And when you do give thanks, what more specifically do you give thanks for?
Health, our children. Leonard has been through some medical crises and got better. Doctors were able to fix him up. I'm thankful for those doctors.
Just in general.
Yeah, there is there in the Old Testament it talks about more than once. Let me count the ways of your, and let me count the benefits that God gives us, and in doing so, how often do we find our own blessings? So you worked as an engineer, and Joanne, you did work outside the home. You tell us about your profession.
I was a teacher. When I first graduated, I taught 2nd grade here in Michigan in Garden City for a couple of years, and then when we got married, we moved out to Iowa. I got a job in Marion, Iowa, which is a suburb of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I taught 1st grade there for 3 years until our son came along, and then I stayed home with him. And then when we came back to Michigan, after both kids got into, Heather was in middle school, Jay was in high school, I went back to work teaching English as a second language. And I've always felt like God has mission for me. He wants me something, and I'm always looking, searching for that, trying to see where. And I don't always see it at the time that I'm doing it, but afterwards, I think this is something that God wants me to do. And when I was teaching ESL, I acted also as an advocate for some of those folks because they came to America searching for a better life. And I tried to do whatever I could to help them learn the language, but also how to navigate the system here.
Right. Yeah, being an ESL teacher, it gives you, I would imagine, a really special viewpoint when it comes to matters of immigration and immigration law and how the country behaves. Have either of you ever had a job you wish you had, but really never told anybody about? When you think of an engineer, well, I want to be an engineer my whole life, but would there have been something else for Leonard Sackett? Would there have been something else other than a teacher for Joanne?
No, not for me.
No, not for me either. I thought once, boy, I'd like to spend all my time carpentry, woodworking like that. But the reality is, I'd starve to death because, you still got to produce the stuff in a time, and I'm very slow at it. I'm probably overly meticulous, and
Right.
I'd starve to death.
He does beautiful work though when he's.
So I really enjoyed being an engineer. I really enjoyed my time at Cadillac as a development engineer and as a release responder.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
Andy, he could be a plumber, he could be an electrician, because I never have to follow any of those guys
Wow.
to come over to fix anything. Because Leonard can fix everything.
I might break it twice on the way of fixing it. Figure it out.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, have you ever had a God moment? And I'm kind of playing off of what you said earlier, Joanne, about your time up north and being outside. Have you had a time when you felt, gosh, that God, is something or someone was involved in this circumstance other than me?
Shall I go with this one? Yeah. Well, when we first came back to Michigan, we had Jay, and Joanne got pregnant with our second son. And trouble is that about 6 months, 5 months,
I think it was about
I think the water broke.
Yeah.
Water broke. And at that time, she had to stay in bed. Boom. The only way to prolong the pregnancy is for her to stay in bed. And one of the things was that I'd come home from work, my family, mother, my sisters, and all these strange women from St. David's I didn't know. I'd come in the house, go downstairs, and there's this strange woman doing our laundry from St. David's. It was kind of weird. But anyway.
Well, yeah, when you think of what you put in your laundry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These strangers. Yeah, it was kind of, okay. But anyway, after about 7 months, Joanne did go into labor, and Aaron was born. But he didn't make it. But he was in the hospital for 3 days on ventilator and oxygen. Okay. But he was in the hospital with assistance for 2 or 3 days, and it was a black period. And finally, it came time that the doctor came and talked to us and said, he's not going to make it. So what do you want to do? Keep on taking these extraordinary methods, or what do you want to do? And of course, as the parents, we had to decide what we thought was best for him. So we said, pull the plug. So we sat in this darkened room. They turned the lights down. The two of us are just sitting in this darkened room with black thoughts, waiting to know when it's going to be over. And it's a very dark time. And what happens then? Al Corner comes walking through the door. Of course, at the same time, he's got a cheery look on his face saying, how are you guys doing? At the same time, of course, he realized that we're not doing well at all. But I think that was very much a God moment. He came in and prayed with us. We really needed him. We needed someone right at that instant. And there he was. And it turned out, I didn't know it then, but Al had just become a deacon a short time before that. So he got thrown into the deep end of the pool.
Wow.
But that was very much a God moment. I'm an engineer. I don't really go in for that stuff so much, but I can't. If it was a God moment, that was it.
Yeah. A wonderful coincidence, if you'd say.
Great.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. One of the questions I had for you also was, you guys have you've made it past 30, and you've assembled a few years under your belt. What advice would you give your younger self?
I think I would tell my younger self to have more confidence in your abilities, because you can do a lot more than.
Yeah, to be more confident in yourself. Yeah.
To have more patience with myself and with others.
Yeah.
And it's always good in the house to have a workroom on the second floor and a workroom in the basement.
Oh.
It's in the basement.
Sometimes it's just better to keep your mouth shut and go downstairs.
Yeah. I get it. I get it. I get it.
Just the way it is, and it makes things work out better.
Hmm. Well, tell me about these days. What are a couple of the activities you're partaking in now that you're really getting a lot of enjoyment out of?
Joanne loves sewing.
I'm sewing.
Yep, you should. You got your sewing masks.
All these masks. My arthritis in my thumbs are really sticking in there, but
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I keep on sewing.
But before that, it was quilts.
Yeah.
Before
I like
Corona came along, it was quilts.
And then quilts. And what do you do with your quilts? That's the thing about quilting is you keep making them and you only have really a couple of beds.
Right. My granddaughters have quilts. My son, our son and his wife have a couple, and I've given them to nieces and nephews, and nephews, friends.
Mm-hmm.
Give them away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, how about you, Leonard? What are some of the activities you're doing these days?
It goes in spurts, but my main one is, well, I got the band out there, of course. That's my toy. I'm always modifying that, playing with it, trying things out.
What kind of things are you working on? Oh, go ahead.
Right now, I'm in the jewelry box making mode. Each of the women have one, so now I'm making jewelry boxes for the granddaughters. Just small ones, simple ones for them. Ones, and then I'm working on a batch of about 6 or 8 boxes. Just generating them out. Just playing in my workshop.
Okay.
Getting dusty and dirty, so when I come up Joanne downstairs, Joanne tells me to go back down.
Tell me tell me your 3 favorite foods.
High calorie, high calorie, high calorie.
Ice cream.
Do you have a favorite flavor?
Oh, moose track.
Moose Tracks ice cream. That's one of your favorite foods. Okay, people may argue is that a food or not, but you know.
I love lobster.
Yeah.
You love what?
Lobster tail.
Lobster tail, yes.
Yeah.
An excuse to eat melted butter.
Right.
Lots of it. We have a family tradition of yellow cake or something with peanut butter frosting. I love that.
What is it?
For birthdays, we always have to have peanut butter frosting cake.
Oh yes.
A yellow cake, and you make peanut butter frosting, and it's the best.
It's a tradition.
Yeah.
Everybody and each of the kids in the family have to like it.
Yeah. That's
One of the
always
things we do.
make.
Wow. And you just had a birthday, and Leonard did not flunk the peanut butter icing.
I did it.
He made me last week. He made me a really good cake.
Now let me ask you this question: what spectator sport do you enjoy most?
Soccer. I like
Soccer.
Soccer and television. It's a more active game. And of course the grandkids play it too, so I'm watching them. That got us hooked on it, I think. Got me hooked on it was watching the grandkids than watching the professionals on TV. Very interesting game. Baseball's just too slow for me. I just can't sit there and watch the pitches. So soccer is a pretty active sport, so I like that.
And football and hockey, everything moves so fast I can't find out where anything is. We like soccer. I like.
So you like soccer too?
Yeah, I love to watch the girls play.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this question: what, living or dead, who would you like to have dinner with? Anybody?
I would like Winston Churchill, just because I've read several of his books, and he's got a very broad understanding of history and the world. It'd just be interesting to talk with him about him and Western civilization. Just like to do it over a few pints of beer.
I think I'd like to have dinner with Michelle Obama.
Michelle Obama.
Yeah. Seems like
Well,
a wonderful person. All of the things that she does, I just would like to get kids.
Yeah. What are you reading?
The Second Mountain. I'm reading The Second Mountain by David Brooks right
Okay.
Really good.
And I remember reading a review of that. That's been out a little while. Remind us of what that book's about.
Well,
Is it the second part of your life or something?
first you're always trying to climb and getting better and better and better at something, and then it, um, you hit the peak, and then you have a crash.
Okay.
You have to climb again just to improve yourself. It's not the idea of just getting advancement financially or um, socially. You need to make yourself a better person.
Okay.
And the second mountain is talks about making yourself a better person.
How about you, Leonard?
Well, as an engineer, English is my 10th language, not my first. It's way down the list. Be honest, in high school and stuff, I was completely confused by the English. But anyway, right now I'm into it. The book I'm reading right now is, it's backwards, isn't it? Master
No, that's
Word. It's the history of the written language from whenever up through by William Bernstein. I really like some of his books. He used to do a lot of financial books. Now he does a lot of others, and Dr. Bernstein can find a good yarn, make a good yarn. So I'm reading in this one of his at the present time. Just finding out, I didn't realize that, when first writing and stuff, words didn't have spaces between them. They were all just ran together, and it had to be read silently or read out loud. The monks had to sit there and read it out loud to understand it. Otherwise, you couldn't do it in your mind. And just how things progressed over time, and just stuff that I never even thought about or knew about. It's an interesting read. I enjoy his books.
Well, that's terrific.
A lot of books on finance.
Oh, that was a hobby,
yeah.
Yeah. My goodness, what's the last movie you watched? That you find memorable?
Yeah, The Professor and the Madman.
Oh yeah.
Writing the first Oxford English dictionary.
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Yeah.
Based on facts, I guess.
I'm sure they took liberty with it, but it was.
Yeah. Huh. Let's see. And let me ask you this: how are you keeping your balance during this socially distant time? Obviously, we're talking in the middle of a pandemic here.
Sometimes, he's mentioned the workshop and the upstairs and the workshop downstairs. We have to go to our separate places. But keeping sewing helps me focus on. And I love to watch the birds. I'm sitting here while we speak, and we have 4 bird babies out in the backyard. Watching them, we have so many birds out there.
Right.
Forget what's going on.
I think in the daytime we kind of go our separate ways and just do our things. But it comes around supper time, 6 o'clock at night. We watch PBS News Hour. We like that one. It's an hour program that's intelligent news. And then we sometimes watch a movie. We've got 2 or 3 series that Joanne's been watching, and I watch in once in a while.
Okay. And are you getting outside much?
When the weather's nice, we like to go for walks.
Not enough, though. My weight has gone up.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Butter frosting.
Yeah. I think they call it, Len, the COVID-15.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you think of everybody buying all that food, well, it's got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
It's and are you feeling concerned, or are you feeling let me ask you this question, because I think that's an obvious answer. To what degree has your faith helped you out during this time?
Oh, if I didn't have that, I think I would really go nuts.
Yeah.
I keep thinking that we're going to be okay.
Yeah, I think
but it is scary. It is very scary.
I don't find it so scary. Joanne finds it scary. I find it just an inconvenience.
Yeah. I mean, she finds it well. And is that based in your faith, Len? That, I mean, you kind of know that things are going to work out. God just kind of does that, or?
Yeah, I mean, we're man, we're mankind. We're going to be on this world for 100,000 years, or maybe a few 100,000 years if we're smart with each other. But you look at the universe, the stars, the expanse of it, just everything that He's created, and we're just a small part of it.
Yeah.
And we can screw things up pretty good if we want to, but yet
Yeah.
it'll go on. God will,
Yeah.
it'll go on. The plants will grow, and something will go on.
Yeah.
As far as personally concerned, I'm more concerned about my grandkids and
Yeah.
that than I am about myself personally.
Mhm.
I don't want anything to happen to them.
Right. Right.
But
What have you learned anything about yourself during this pandemic, during this lockdown?
Well, the value of our family, the value of being close to family, learning that it's a lot. I mean, I've always been close to family, but it's so much more important to me than I even realized. The value of friends. People are coming together and calling each other.
same, reaching out to relatives and stuff. Things, there's always relatives and things. Well, I can call them next year. I'll call them tomorrow. I'll do this
Right. Yeah.
manana kind of thing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you
Right.
start realizing, well, there might not be manana.
Right.
I had a cousin, one of my cousins, his grandson has coronavirus. And I think about it, wow, that could be one of my grandkids. This isn't funny kind of stuff. And I haven't talked to him in several years, so I had to give him a call.
Right.
Wish his family well.
We used to have family reunions every summer with the whole family. He's got a big, and then we kind of, after his mother died, kind of stopped doing it so much. And I think we need to get back and start doing it again. You don't
Yeah.
might not be able to do it next
Yeah. Yeah. I think those are really strong messages because before you know it, Leonard, it goes by, oh, I'll call them next year, I'll call them next year. And before you know it, they're gone.
Yeah.
They're gone. So do you think, have you had any, what do you think about the afterlife when you think of what lays beyond this mortal realm?
We might have different opinions on it.
That's fine. I mean, as long as you can, I mean, you may go to your different workrooms after this interview, but
to me, it's kind of like the Big Bang. There's a point, discontinuity, and you don't know what happened before then. They think the universe was created when the Big Bang. Well, maybe it's a point, discontinuity. Same with life. You die. I don't know what goes beyond that point, whether it branches out into something or it's just over in some way. But either way, God still exists, and either way, it goes on. So I might have an afterlife which is happy and glorious or whatever, and maybe it just gets snuffed out. I hope it doesn't, because I look at it and say, over our lifetime, we learned so much. It'd be a shame to have that just all of a sudden disappear. And in some ways, God seems to conserve and keep things. So I have some doubts that He'd just allow this just to go away, that it would go on. But I don't know.
Oh boy. I don't have any really great thoughts. I believe in the afterlife. I had more faith and hope believing that way. I don't think of it ending.
Yeah. Let me ask you a bit more about your charitable passions. This is kind of how we started this interview, and I'd like to kind of go back to that. If you had $1 million that somebody just dropped on your doorstep, what world problem would you contribute to help alleviate? Where does your generous passion take you?
Well, homeless. Poor and homeless.
I think we talked about it a few times. What if we won the lottery? Boy, what would we do with that money? You know, everybody kind of dreams
St.
that.
David's would have all their buildings redone.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, the church wouldn't have a mortgage. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's, let's say, you know, it's the homeless, the needy, that. But there's also the arts. You know, man's got to have music. Man's
Yeah.
got to have
Yeah.
beauty.
Hmm.
So I think that's all part of it too. Is
Yeah.
the beauty of the things around us. You got to have that because the grandkids have to see that kind of stuff. We can't. Feeding the homeless and feeding the needy is important, but there's also other things like the arts.
And
Very important.
We have symphony tickets, CSO tickets every
Yeah.
year, and I like to donate to that because I want to continue their work
Yeah.
with each other.
But there's simpler things with the Detroit Zoo. We like to support that.
I appreciate that. I have a lot of relatives there. Yeah. So I guess a kind of a wrap-up question. As soon as these emergency rules are lifted, how would you answer this? I'm going to make a beeline to
My
blank.
grandkids.
Your grandkids.
Yeah. And then we'll go up north.
Yes, then we'll go up north.
Take them all with us.
I'm also going to go over to the lumber store, which is closed right now, and buy board feet of exotic different woods and have them stashed away because right now I'm wood starved.
Maybe
What
go
up
online.
north? What up
Go
north?
online.
Yeah, Joanne, I'd count the rafters if I were you before you go to bed tonight.
Yeah.
Well, you guys, this has been very rich, and I, all the years we've known each other, there's some things that I've learned from you here, and I think it's just wonderful for our parish to get to know other parishioners in more dynamic ways, and to appreciate the road that you've been on, the gifts that you have, the ways that you have stayed faithful to the call of God on your life, and so thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, episode 1 now in the can. Leonard and Joanne Sackett in Berkeley, thank you for being our guest on the Lives of the Saints.
Good. Bye-bye.